The weekend I drove out to my best friend's family orchard to help with the harvest. I had no idea I would leave 3 days later a completely different man, and it had nothing to do with apples. My name is Dean Foster. I'm 32, I install commercial HVAC systems for a living, and up until that October, my life had a shape I was mostly at peace with. Work during the week. Beers with the guys on Friday. A quiet apartment that never quite felt lived in, even after 4 years. I wasn't unhappy. I just wasn't anything in particular. I had learned to be fine with fine. Mason Hale had been my best friend since we were 14, the kind of friendship that survives college, breakups, 2 job losses, and 1 very bad tattoo neither of us talks about anymore. His family owned an orchard 2 hours outside the city, 40 acres of apple and pear trees that had been in his father's side for 3 generations, until his father passed 6 years back and left the whole operation to his mother, Claire. I had met Claire maybe half a dozen times over the years. Graduations. A 4th of July cookout. Mason's 30th birthday, where she'd made a cake so good I asked for the recipe and then never actually made it. She was the kind of woman people described as put together, though that phrase always undersold her. She ran an orchard by herself after burying a husband, and she did it without turning it into a tragedy she made other people carry. So when Mason called me on a Tuesday night sounding more tired than I'd heard him in years, I didn't hesitate. I need bodies, he said. Harvest crew bailed on us. Half of them found better pay at a distribution warehouse 2 towns over, and moms out there trying to run pickers, a press, and a farm stand with, like, 4 people who actually know what they're doing. When do you need me? Friday. Bring boots you don't care about. I told him I'd be there. I didn't think twice about it. That was the thing about Mason. 10 years of friendship meant you didn't calculate favors, you just showed up. I packed a duffel bag Thursday night, half paying attention, half thinking about nothing at all, which was exactly the kind of weekend I expected. Pick apples. Drink beer with Mason around a fire pit. Drive home Sunday with sore shoulders and a bag of cider donuts. Nothing about that weekend, on paper, should have rearranged anything in me. I got to the orchard just after 10 on Friday morning. The gravel driveway wound up through rows of trees heavy with red and gold, and the air smelled like crushed fruit and cold dirt, sharper than city air, cleaner in a way that made you notice your own lungs. Mason met me at the gate wearing a flannel that had clearly seen 3 harvests too many, waving me toward the equipment barn like a man who had aged 5 years in 5 days. You look like hell, I said. I feel like hell. Mom's better at this than me, which is humbling, considering I grew up here. Where is she? He nodded toward the press house. In there, probably fighting with the machine again. Go say hi. I've got to deal with a truck that won't start. I found Claire exactly where Mason said, sleeves rolled to her elbows, both hands buried in the guts of an old cider press that had apparently decided this was the week to quit working. Her hair was pulled back under a faded ball cap, a streak of grease across one cheekbone she clearly didn't know was there. She looked up when the door creaked, and for half a second, before she recognized me, her face had the focused, unguarded look of someone mid-problem, not performing anything for anyone. Then she smiled, and it changed into something warmer. Dean Foster, she said. You actually came. Mason made it sound like a national emergency. It's close. She wiped her hands on a rag hanging from her belt loop. This press has been temperamental since August, and this is the worst possible week for it to finally give out. I looked past her at the machine. Mind if I take a look? I fix things that move air for a living, but machines are machines. She studied me for a second, the way you study someone deciding whether to hand them something valuable. Be my guest. I've been fighting it for an hour and all I've accomplished is getting angrier at it. It took me 20 minutes to find the problem, a belt worn thin enough to slip under load, easy enough to bypass temporarily with a spare I found in a bin of half-forgotten parts. When the motor caught and held, Claire let out a short laugh, more relief than joy, and pressed both hands flat against the press like she was thanking it personally. You just saved us a full day, she said. I got lucky. It's usually not that simple. Most useful people say that. She looked at me properly then, not the polite once-over you give a guest, something closer to actually seeing someone. Mason undersold you. He said you were good with tools. He didn't say you'd fix in 20 minutes what a repair company quoted us 3 days and $800 for. I'll take payment in cider donuts. That got a real laugh out of her, quick and unguarded, and something in my chest noted it the way you notice weather changing before you can name the front moving in. The rest of Friday went fast, the way physical work does when there's a clear task in front of you. I hauled crates, helped set up the roadside stand, learned the difference between a Honeycrisp and a Gala from a woman who'd forgotten more about apples than I would ever learn. Mason worked beside us for a while, then got pulled away by a phone call about a delivery truck, then another call, then a third, until by dinner he was apologizing more than he was present. Go handle it, Claire told him. Dean and I have the stand covered. You sure? We managed a full harvest before you were tall enough to reach the counter, Mason. We'll survive an evening. He left looking grateful and slightly guilty, and Claire and I spent the next 2 hours running the little roadside stand together, selling bags of apples to families driving out from the city for a weekend of pretending to be rural. She had an easy way with the customers, warm but efficient, never letting a conversation stretch past what the line behind it could afford. I mostly bagged and made change and watched her work, thinking that I hadn't laughed that much in one evening in longer than I wanted to admit. When the last car pulled away and the light had gone the color of the apples themselves, she leaned back against the stand's wooden counter and exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since March. Thank you, she said. Genuinely. I don't think I've said that enough today. You don't have to keep thanking me. I'm having a good time. She raised an eyebrow. Fixing machines and hauling crates. Better than my usual Friday. What's your usual Friday? I thought about it honestly instead of giving the easy answer. Takeout. A show I'm not really watching. Texting people I don't actually talk to. Something in her expression softened, not pity, something closer to recognition. That sounds lonelier than you meant it to sound. Maybe, I said. I've gotten used to it. Used to isn't the same as fine with it. I didn't have a response for that. She didn't push. She just picked up the cash box and said it was time to get inside before the raccoons decided the leftover apples belonged to them, and the moment folded itself back into ordinary evening, though I kept turning her sentence over long after we'd locked the stand. Around 8, a family with 2 young kids pulled in right as we were about to close, the kids racing between rows of pumpkins stacked by the entrance while their parents apologized for coming so late. Claire waved off the apology and spent 10 unhurried minutes helping the little girl pick out the reddest apple in the bin, crouching down to her eye level, asking her serious questions about which color she liked best like the answer actually mattered. I stood back and watched, bagging apples for the parents, and found myself thinking that most people performed patience for an audience. Claire wasn't performing anything. There was no one left to impress by then except me, and I don't think she was thinking about me at all in that moment, which somehow made it land harder. When the family finally drove off, headlights swinging back down the gravel road, Claire straightened up and caught me watching her. What? She asked. Nothing. You're just good with people. I've had practice. You learn patience fast when you spend your life waiting on weather and machinery to cooperate. She started stacking crates, and I moved to help without being asked. People are easier than either of those, most days. Not always, I said. She glanced at me sideways. No. Not always. We finished closing up in a comfortable quiet, the kind that only happens between 2 people who've stopped needing to fill every gap with talk, and by the time we walked back up toward the house, the sky had gone the deep blue black of a clear October night, stars sharper than I ever saw them in the city. Dinner that night was the 3 of us at a farmhouse table that had clearly hosted decades of harvest crews before me, Mason too tired to do much besides eat and complain fondly about the day, Claire quieter than she'd been at the stand, watching the 2 of us with an expression I couldn't quite name. After dinner, Mason went down like a felled tree, asleep on the couch by 9, leaving Claire and me at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of decaf neither of us really wanted, just something to hold on to while the conversation kept finding new rooms to wander into. She asked about my job, my apartment, whether I was seeing anyone, and I told her the honest, unremarkable truth, that I wasn't, that it had been a while, that I'd stopped minding it most days. She told me about the orchard, about the 6 years since her husband died, about how people kept expecting her to sell the land and move somewhere easier, and how she kept not doing it because easier wasn't the same as right. Everyone assumes a woman running 40 acres alone must be barely holding on, she said. They say it kindly, but it's still an assumption. Like competence and grief can't share the same body. I don't think that about you. I know, she said, looking at me steadily. That's actually rare. I went to bed in the guest room that night more awake than I had any right to be, replaying a conversation that shouldn't have meant as much as it did. Saturday was the real harvest day, crews of neighbors and hired hands moving through the rows with bins and ladders, Mason running logistics between 2 orchards and a truck rental he was fighting with over the phone half the morning. Claire put me on picking duty alongside her in the north block, the two of us working opposite sides of the same row, close enough to talk, far enough to work. You're better at this than most first-timers, she said, watching me twist an apple free without bruising it. I had a good teacher yesterday. Flattery gets you an extra donut at lunch. I'll take it. By mid-morning, we'd fallen into an easy rhythm, trading small stories, the kind that don't matter individually but add up to something when you stack enough of them together. She told me about the year a late frost took half the crop and she'd cried in the equipment barn where no one could see her, then gone back inside and made dinner like nothing had happened, because that was what the day still required of her. I told her about the year my father lost his job and how I'd learned to be the kid who didn't add to anyone's worry, and how that habit had followed me into adulthood whether I wanted it to or not. That's why you're good at showing up for people, she said. You learned it early. Doesn't mean it isn't tiring. It's not tiring when it's for people I actually care about. She looked at me for a second longer than the sentence required, then went back to picking, and I felt the air between us shift half a degree, small enough to explain away, noticeable enough that I couldn't stop thinking about it. Around noon, we broke for lunch under a big oak at the edge of the north block, sitting on an old wooden bench Mason's grandfather had apparently built decades earlier, sturdy in the stubborn way things built by hand tend to be. Claire had packed sandwiches that morning, thick with roast turkey and something sharp and homemade she wouldn't tell me the recipe for no matter how many times I asked. Family secret, she said. You'd have to marry into it. Noted, I said, and she laughed like it was nothing, but something in her eyes caught on the word for half a second longer than the joke required. We ate slowly, watching the crews move through the rows below us, and she told me about the first harvest after her husband died, how she'd nearly sold the whole operation that winter because the idea of running it alone felt impossible, how a neighbor had shown up unannounced every morning for 2 weeks just to stand beside her while she made decisions, not doing the work for her, just making sure she didn't have to decide alone. That's what got me through it, she said. Not advice. Just someone steady standing next to me while I figured it out. Is that what this weekend has been? Someone standing next to you? She considered the question seriously instead of brushing it off. It's been more than that. I just haven't figured out yet how to say it without it sounding like more than it should be, this early. You can say it, I told her. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at me for a long moment, then looked back out at the orchard instead of answering directly, and I let the silence sit there instead of pushing it, because some things need room before they're ready to be spoken. The trouble started a little after 2, when the sky that had been merely gray all morning turned the specific bruised color that anyone who's grown up around farms learns to fear. Mason came jogging up the row, phone in hand, face tight. Storm's moving faster than the forecast said. We've got maybe 40 minutes before it's on top of us, and half the north block still isn't picked. Claire was already moving. Get everyone on the ladders. Dean, you're with me on the low branches, we take what we can reach fast and worry about perfect later. For the next 35 minutes, the orchard turned into controlled chaos, crews moving fast, bins filling, the wind picking up in gusts that sent loose leaves scattering sideways. Claire worked like someone who had done this exact scramble a dozen times before, calling instructions without raising her voice, keeping the whole operation from tipping into panic through sheer calm authority. I stayed beside her, moving bins, catching a ladder that started to slide when the wind hit it wrong, staying close enough that when the first hard rain came sideways across the field, we ended up sprinting for the equipment barn together, both of us soaked through by the time we got the door shut behind us. We stood there catching our breath, rain hammering the metal roof loud enough to make conversation difficult, both of us laughing the particular laugh that comes right after something almost went wrong and didn't. We got maybe 70% of it, she said, wiping water off her face with a sleeve that was equally wet. Could have been worse. You got everyone moving fast. That wasn't luck. She looked at me, hair plastered to her forehead, cheeks flushed from the run and the cold and the adrenaline. Neither was you catching that ladder. You could have let it go and stayed dry. Didn't occur to me to let it go. Something passed between us then, quick and unmistakable, the kind of look that lasts a half-second too long to be nothing. She looked away first, toward the barn door, toward the rain. "We should find towels before Mason thinks we drowned," she said, but her voice had lost its usual steadiness, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. We didn't talk about it. Not that night, not the next morning. But something had shifted, the way weather shifts before you can point to the exact moment it changed, and both of us seemed to know it without saying so. Saturday night, after the crew had gone home and Mason had collapsed into another exhausted sleep on the couch, Claire and I ended up back at the kitchen table, this time with actual wine instead of decaf, both of us still faintly smelling like rain and crushed apples. "You didn't have to stay out there with me today," she said. "You could have let Mason handle the coordinating and stayed dry under the stand roof. I wanted to be useful. You were more than useful." She turned her glass slowly on the table. "I haven't had someone match my pace like that in a long time. Not since my husband, honestly." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said the true thing instead of the safe thing. "I didn't expect this weekend to feel like this." "Like what?" "Like something I don't want to end on Sunday." She went quiet, studying her glass instead of me, and for a moment I thought I'd said too much, crossed some line that had been invisible right up until I stepped over it. Then she looked up, and her eyes had the same unguarded focus I'd seen the first afternoon, before she'd known I was watching. "I've thought the same thing today," she said carefully. "More than once. And I've spent most of the afternoon telling myself that's a foolish thing for a woman my age to feel about her son's oldest friend. I don't think it's foolish. You're 20 years younger than me, Dean. I know how old I am." That earned a small, surprised laugh, the tension breaking just slightly. "I'm serious. This isn't nothing. If we're feeling the same thing, it isn't small, and it isn't simple, and it involves my son, who is asleep 20 feet from us." "I know that too." I met her eyes. "I'm not trying to make it simple. I'm just done pretending I don't feel what I feel because the math looks complicated on paper." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the rain outside became the only sound in the room. Then she reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, just close enough that the space between us felt charged in a way silence usually isn't. "We can't do anything about this tonight," she said softly. "Not with Mason in the next room, not with everything unclear. But I want you to know you're not imagining it." "I wasn't going to do anything tonight," I said. "I just needed you to know I felt it too." She nodded, and something in her shoulders eased, like she'd been braced for me to deny it and was relieved I hadn't. We sat there a while longer, not touching, talking about nothing important, both of us fully aware that something important had already been said. Later that same night, unable to sleep after the wine and the conversation and everything left unsaid between the lines of it, I went out to the fire pit behind the barn where Mason and I had spent half our teenage summers burning scrapwood and talking about nothing important. I hadn't expected company. Claire found me there 20 minutes later, wrapped in a heavy cardigan against the cold, 2 mugs of something warm balanced carefully in her hands. "Couldn't sleep either," she said, handing me one of the mugs and settling onto the bench beside me, close but not too close, the fire throwing shifting light across both of us. "Guilty conscience. Something like that. Or maybe just too much to think about to let my mind settle." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I keep running the last 2 days back through my head, trying to figure out the exact moment this stopped being simple. For me it was the press house," I said. "The first afternoon. You didn't even know I was watching you work, and I remember thinking I hadn't seen anyone look that certain about anything in a long time." She smiled into the firelight, quiet for a moment. "For me it might have been the storm. Watching you catch that ladder instead of letting it go. It's such a small thing, but it told me something about how you're built, the kind of person who doesn't hesitate when it actually matters. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I know. That's exactly why it mattered." We sat like that for a long while, the fire cracking and settling, neither of us saying much else, both of us aware that the quiet between us had stopped feeling like the kind you fill with small talk and started feeling like the kind two people share when they've already said the important part and are simply choosing to stay close to each other a little longer. Eventually the cold won out, and we walked back toward the house together, close enough that our shoulders brushed twice on the porch steps, neither of us moving away either time. Sunday morning arrived gray and quiet, the storm having scrubbed the sky clean overnight, everything outside smelling like wet earth and cold apples. Mason was up early, apologizing again for how little time he'd had to actually hang out with me all weekend, promising we'd grab beers back in the city soon to make up for it. I told him not to worry about it, that I'd had a good weekend regardless, which was truer than he understood. Claire drove me to my truck when it was time to leave, the two of us alone for the first time since the previous night. She stood with her arms crossed against the morning chill, looking at me with an expression that mixed warmth and caution in equal measure. I meant what I said, she told me. About not doing anything rushed. This needs to be handled carefully, for Mason's sake as much as ours. I'm not going anywhere, I said. Take whatever time you need. I just don't want to pretend Friday and Saturday didn't happen. They happened, she said quietly. I'm not going to pretend otherwise either. I drove home with the radio off, the same way I'd driven home the day my last relationship ended, except this time the silence in the truck felt entirely different, less like an ending and more like the quiet before something was about to begin. For the next 2 weeks, Claire and I texted carefully, the kind of messages that stayed technically appropriate while carrying an unmistakable undercurrent, updates about the orchard, questions about my work, small honesties neither of us had planned to share but somehow always did. Mason had no idea, and the not telling him sat uneasily with both of us, a debt we both knew we'd eventually have to pay. The truth came out sooner than either of us wanted, the way truths usually do. Mason called me on a Wednesday night, his voice tight in a way I recognized immediately as trouble. My mom's been weird for 2 weeks, he said. Distracted. Smiling at her phone like a teenager. I asked her about it and she went quiet in a way that scared me a little. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean I think something's going on with her, and I don't know what, and I guess I'm asking if you know anything, since you two seemed unusually close all weekend. I could have lied. I thought about it for exactly 1 second before deciding that wasn't who I wanted to be, not with Mason, not after 10 years of friendship built on not lying to each other about things that mattered. I need to tell you something, I said, and I need you to actually let me finish before you react. The silence on the other end of the line felt like standing at the edge of something with no way to see the bottom. I told him everything, the press house, the storm, the kitchen table conversation, careful to make clear that nothing physical had happened, that we'd both been deliberate about not rushing anything precisely because of how much his feelings mattered to both of us. When I finished, the silence stretched long enough that I started to wonder if the call had dropped. You and my mom, he finally said, voice flat with disbelief. I know how it sounds. Do you? Because it sounds insane, Dean. She's my mother. I know that. I've thought about that every single day since Friday. And you decided to pursue it anyway. I decided I wasn't going to lie about how I felt just because it was inconvenient. I kept my voice steady even though my hands weren't. Mason, I've watched you for years try to protect your mom from being lonely, from being underestimated, from people who think a widow running an orchard alone needs saving. I'm not trying to save her. I'm telling you that somewhere in one weekend, I started caring about her in a way I didn't expect and can't undo. This is insane, he said again, quieter this time, more hurt than angry. You're my best friend. I still am. That hasn't changed. It feels like it's changed everything. He hung up before I could answer that, and I sat in my apartment for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, wondering if I'd just cost myself both a 10-year friendship and whatever this thing with Claire might have become. Claire called an hour later, her voice tired in a way I hadn't heard before. He called me first, she said. Before you told him, actually. He'd already guessed most of it. Your version just confirmed it. How is he? Hurt. Confused. Angry, mostly at himself for not seeing it sooner, I think, more than at either of us. She paused. He asked me if I was doing this because I'm lonely. What did you tell him? I told him loneliness might have opened the door, but it isn't what walked through it. Her voice caught slightly. I told him I'm not going to apologize for choosing something that makes me feel like myself again, and that I love him too much to let his discomfort talk me out of something honest. How did he take that? Not well. But he heard it. That matters, even if he's not ready to like it yet. We didn't see each other for the next 3 weeks. Mason needed space, and both of us respected that more than we wanted to, even as it cost us something to stay apart. We texted sparingly, careful, aware that every message carried weight beyond its words. I threw myself into work, taking on extra jobs I didn't need the money for, staying late at sites long after my crew had gone home, anything to keep my hands busy enough that my mind couldn't wander back to the orchard. Claire, from what she told me later, threw herself into the last push of the harvest season, the two of us both busy in ways that were partly real and partly a way of not sitting still with how much we missed each other. Some nights I typed out long messages I never sent, deleting them one line at a time until nothing was left but a blank text box and the same restless feeling that had put the words there in the first place. Once, close to midnight, I actually sent one before I could talk myself out of it. I hope you're doing okay. I know this is harder on you than you're letting on. She didn't answer until the next morning, a single line back that somehow said more than a paragraph could have. I'm not okay, but I'm not sorry either. Those two things can both be true. I read that message probably 15 times over the following week. It became the thing I held onto whenever I started doubting whether any of it had been worth the cost to my friendship with Mason. She wasn't sorry. Neither was I. That had to count for something, even in the middle of all the uncertainty neither of us could fully control. A mutual friend mentioned, almost in passing, that Claire had been seen at the farmer's market looking distracted, twice ringing up the wrong total for regular customers who'd known her for years. It shouldn't have made me feel anything close to relief, knowing she was struggling too, but it did, in the selfish, human way that wants proof you aren't hurting alone. Mason texted me first, eventually, for weeks after that phone call, a short message that said only, "Can we talk?" Actually talk, not fight. We met at a diner halfway between the city and the orchard, both of us awkward in a way 10 years of friendship had never made us before. He looked tired, older somehow, like the last month had aged him the way the harvest weekend had aged him in reverse. I've had a lot of time to think, he said, stirring coffee he wasn't drinking. About why this bothered me so much. And it isn't really about the age thing, or even really about you specifically. Then what is it? It's that my dad's been gone 6 years, and some part of me still thinks of Mom as his, still frozen at the version of her from before he died. Watching her be happy about someone who isn't him felt like watching her move on from him, and I wasn't ready for that, even though I know that's not fair to her. That makes sense, I said carefully. I don't think it makes you wrong to feel it. I just hope it doesn't mean you can't eventually be okay with this. He was quiet for a while, turning the coffee cup slowly. She seems happier than I've seen her in years. Happier than she was even before Dad got sick, honestly. I hate how much that's true, because it means I have to actually deal with what it means instead of just being mad. I'm not trying to replace anyone, Mason. I know that's not something anyone could do even if they wanted to. I know, he said, and for the first time since the phone call, some of the old warmth crept back into his voice. I'm not saying I'm fully okay with it yet. I'm saying I'm trying to be. That's different, but it's something. It's enough for now. He looked at me for a long moment, then managed something close to a real smile. If you hurt her, I will absolutely never forgive you, best friend or not. Fair. And this is going to be weird at family dinners for the rest of our lives. Also fair. We didn't fully repair everything that afternoon, some things take longer than one conversation, but it was a start, and starts were more than either of us had a month earlier. Claire and I saw each other properly for the first time since the harvest 3 days later, at a small coffee shop in the city, neutral ground, no orchard, no family history sitting in the walls around us. She looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen on her before, hands wrapped around her cup like it was the only thing keeping her steady. I need to know something, she said, before this goes any further. Okay. If this happened only because a storm made everything feel more dramatic than it actually was, if it fades once real life sets back in, I need you to tell me now, before I let myself believe in it completely. I reached across the table, and this time I actually took her hand instead of leaving the space charged and empty the way I had that first night. It's not the storm, I said. It's not the harvest, or the adrenaline, or any of it being unusual enough to feel important. I've thought about you every day since I left that Sunday morning, in the most ordinary, unremarkable ways. Wondering what you were doing. Wanting to tell you about my day. That's not drama. That's just what caring about someone actually feels like. Her eyes filled, but she smiled through it, the same way she had that first afternoon in the press house, unguarded and real. I've been telling myself the same thing and being too scared to trust it. You don't have to be scared of it anymore. The first dinner the three of us had together after that diner conversation was stiff in ways none of us tried to hide. Mason cracked jokes that landed half a beat too flat. Claire kept refilling water glasses that didn't need refilling, the way people busy their hands when their heart isn't sure what else to do. I mostly just tried not to make anything worse by talking too much or too little. Somewhere around dessert, Mason set down his fork and looked at both of us directly, the way he used to look at me right before admitting something he'd been avoiding since we were teenagers. I keep waiting to feel normal about this, he said, and I don't think normal is coming anytime soon. But I watched you two tonight, and I watched you both trying so hard to make this easy for me that you barely talked to each other at all. That's not fair to either of you. We don't need it to be easy, Claire said gently. We need it to be honest. I know. He looked at me. I'm still figuring out how to be okay with this. I don't think that's going to happen overnight. But I don't want my figuring it out to mean you two have to shrink yourselves at my dinner table. It wasn't a full resolution. It wasn't supposed to be. But it was Mason choosing to keep showing up instead of staying away, and that mattered more than any single conversation could have. We took it slowly after that, the way she'd insisted from the beginning, no rushing, no hiding, careful with Mason's feelings even as we stopped hiding our own. He came around gradually, the way people do when given room instead of pressure, showing up to dinners, then longer visits, then eventually a Sunday afternoon where he helped me fix a fence post on the orchard's east line without either of us mentioning why I was suddenly there every other weekend. A year later, I moved into a small house 15 minutes from the orchard, close enough to help during harvest season, far enough to give Claire the independence she'd fought hard to keep since her husband died. We built something slow and deliberate, the opposite of the accidental spark that started it, careful in all the ways that mattered. 2 harvests after the storm that nearly ruined the North Block, I asked Claire to marry me in the exact spot where we'd sprinted for shelter that Saturday afternoon, rain-soaked and laughing, not yet admitting what was happening between us. She said yes before I'd even finished the question, then laughed and told me to finish it anyway because she wanted the whole memory intact. Mason stood at the back of the small gathering we had that following spring, and when it came time for toasts, he raised his glass and said the thing that told me everything had finally, fully healed. My best friend fixed our cider press one weekend, he said, and somehow ended up fixing something in our family I didn't even know needed fixing. Claire cried. I did too, a little, though I'll deny that if you ask me directly. People still ask us sometimes how we got together, and Claire usually gives the short version, that a storm and a broken machine brought us into the same barn at the same time, and neither of us walked back out quite the same person. I usually add that it wasn't really the storm. It was one weekend of watching someone I respected handle chaos with more grace than anyone I'd ever met, and realizing I didn't want to go back to a life where I only saw her a few times a year. Claire kept the orchard running the whole time. Of course, seasons don't pause for anyone's personal life, and I learned the rhythm of it alongside her, year after year, until the harvest crew stopped treating me like a guest and started treating me like someone who belonged in the rows. Mason eventually took on more of the business side himself, and some Saturdays it was the three of us again, working the same stand where Claire and I had first stood shoulder to shoulder selling apples to strangers, except now there was nothing careful or hidden about the way we stood next to each other. The press house still has the same belt I bypassed that first afternoon, though we replaced it properly the following spring. Claire wanted to keep the old one anyway, tucked in a drawer in the equipment barn like a strange kind of memento. When I asked her why, she just shrugged and said some broken things are worth keeping around, as a reminder of what they led to once they finally got fixed. Sometimes the biggest changes in your life don't announce themselves. They show up disguised as a favor for a friend, a broken cider press, a storm that shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. And sometimes the person who finally sees you clearly isn't the person you expected to be looking. Would you have taken the risk if you'd been standing in that barn with the rain coming down and everything suddenly clear? And has someone unexpected ever shown you a version of yourself you didn't know you were missing? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.